It is for me an honor and a privilege to introduce to you our guest, Dr. Harman, who is a distinguished professor from the Southern California Institute of Architecture. And as you may know, he is one of the founders of a philosophical movement, contemporary philosophical movement, named speculative realism. I have here with me some of his works, just a little sample of his works, his books. This is Dante's Hammer. I think this is the new one, Object-Oriented Ontology. And this is the one that some of you were asked to read before this lecture, Towards Speculative Realism. And this is a very engaging book by the professor in Materialism. And also this one, The Quadruple Object. I think that this is a great opportunity to take another hard look on some classical philosophy concepts. Professor Harman, is going to make a presentation on some classical concepts like materialism, realism, idealism. He will make arguments against idealism and materialism, so students, like I said, pay very good attention, because these are the traditional classical concepts of philosophy. And the dynamics of these two sessions, today and tomorrow, will be as follows. First, obviously, the professor is going to make his presentation about an hour, 20 minutes, maybe an hour and a half. And then we can initiate a session of questions, answers, and commentaries. So today's subject, I repeat, is the main thesis of the object-oriented philosophy. And tomorrow, Professor Harman is going to elaborate on some applications of his theory to architecture and to politics and to other subjects. If one of you wants to make a question, and you can make it in Spanish, and we will translate for the professor. There's no problem. And, well, without further ado, you may begin.
Thank you all very much. I've been to Mexico twice before as a tourist. This is my first time lecturing in Mexico. I spoke once in Peru and Argentina, never in Mexico until today. I will try to speak slowly, because if you ever saw my lectures on YouTube, I'm too fast. Even my mother says I'm too fast. She cannot understand me. So I will try to speak slowly, and I will try to say the same thing in several different ways, so nobody is lost. Also, tomorrow I will not be able to stay as long, because I have a flight from San Diego back to Los Angeles to teach in Los Angeles Wednesday morning. So today I will stay a little longer if anybody wants me to and answer any questions you might have. Anyway, again, it's wonderful to be here. Object-oriented ontology. What is this about? Well, in the first place, philosophy is different from all the other fields in that we have to be as broad as possible. There was, of course, Alexius Meinong in Austrian philosophy 100 years ago. In fact, my use of the word object is trying to pay my debt to the Austrian tradition of Brentano, Husserl, Meinong, Twardowski, these other philosophers who were interested in objects. Usually, in everyday language, object suggests something hard, something that is durable and lasts for a long time, something that is not human or not alive, like a Coke bottle, and something that is real. In object-oriented ontology, though, we talk about humans as being objects. We're not dividing between subject and object. Object is for us the general term that means everything that exists or doesn't exist, such as fictional characters, Batman, Popeye, Darth Vader. All of these characters count as objects. Numbers and other mathematical entities, objects. The Autonomous University of Baja California, an object. Each of you, an object. Myself, an object, and so forth. All right. Now, what I'm going to start by talking about is that most of Western philosophy, and most of Western thought in general, has been anti-object oriented. Not all of it, but a lot of it. In fact, most intellectual methods have been attempts to destroy objects. And this happens in two different directions. And so I'm going to start by putting up the first of these, undermining. And as you may know, this is a real English word. It refers to digging under something to make it collapse. Like digging under an enemy's defensive position and making it fall. Or any time you do something that sabotages something or makes it weaker, that's an undermining. What happens a lot of times with objects is people say that objects aren't real. What's real are the smallest things of which the object is built. So let's say atoms or quarks and electrons. This is what scientific materialism usually does. It says everything that we see is actually not as fundamental as the tiniest particles or strings or whatever other physical things are the smallest from which everything is made. This is a kind of undermining. And not just in science, but the dawn of what is called pre-Socratic philosophy. I'm not sure it really counts as philosophy. It's very interesting. I consider them more as early scientists than as philosophers, for reasons I will explain. Thales of Miletus, which is probably pronounced very different in Spanish. Thales or...
Thales de Mileto.
Yeah, Thales de Mileto. Everything is made of this, agua, water. Everything is made of water. This is the first philosopher and physicist in Western civilization. He is also an obvious underminer. Water is the principle of which everything is built. And then, of course, with the different pre-Socratic philosophers, different elements become prominent. Anaximenes thinks it is air, because air is transparent, it has no qualities. If you compress air very tightly, you create metal or bone. If you take air and spread it out, you get fire. Everything made of air. Of course, Leucippus and Democritus believe it is atoms, the uncuttable smallest particles. But that's only one kind of pre-Socratic philosopher. The other one is the kind that talks about the apeiron. And at least in English, we don't usually translate this. We leave it in Greek when we write about them in English. I don't know what you do in Spanish. Whether you leave it in Greek also?
Yeah.
Okay. Same. The Greek word. This sort of boundless, formless, underlying thing from which all specific things emerge and all things pass back into them. So Anaximander thinks in the future all opposites will cancel each other. In the future we will have the apeiron, which inspired Karl Marx, of course, this idea that the social classes and governments would gradually cancel each other. We end up with the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the case of two pre-Socratic philosophers, namely Pythagoras and Anaxagoras, the apeiron existed in the past and was destroyed. In the case of Anaxagoras, which is more famous, nous, or mind, began to think, and the apeiron began to spin very fast and breaks into pieces. In the case of Pythagoras, the apeiron inhales. It breathes in the void or vacuum, and this breaks the apeiron into pieces. And finally, you could say Parmenides. Although Parmenides doesn't use the term apeiron, he uses being, it's the same idea. For Parmenides, the apeiron exists now, not in the past or the future. It exists now. We simply don't notice it because we are deceived by the senses. If you follow the logos, you will see that everything is one, according to Parmenides. Everything is one and motionless. So these sorts of pre-Socratic theories are all undermining theories. Either they find one physical element, water or fire or air, as being at the bottom of everything, or they find the apeiron being at the bottom of everything. There is no pre-Socratic philosopher who would say that this bottle is real, that my chair is real, that the human body is real, that the sun is real. It's all made of something smaller. This is undermining. And we find it usually today in the sciences, although we also find it in some philosophers. So for example, in a number of philosophers, today we find this idea that the whole is what comes first. There's a whole and it breaks into pieces. The young Emmanuel Levinas said this in his work De l'existence à l'existant, which we call Existence and Existence in English, said that there is simply il y a, the French for there is simply being, which is not broken into parts, and it's the human mind that breaks being into parts. This is the young Levinas. He's like a pre-Socratic thinker. Even in Deleuze, there's this idea that the virtual isn't fully broken up into actual parts. In Simondon, Gilbert Simondon, who is becoming more and more popular in the United States, and probably here too, as popular as Deleuze sometimes, Gilbert Simondon thinks we should not focus on individuals, we should focus on the process of individuation. Nothing is ever fully individuated. And also in Jane Bennett, one of my favorite contemporary writers, in her book Vibrant Matter, and in her responses to me and Timothy Morton, she says that there is a single vibrant whole, and it occasionally breaks into temporary swirls, which we call things. But what is primary is this lively whole of which everything is made. Now, why doesn't this work? Why can't we agree with underminers? Why does object-oriented ontology say this is wrong? The main reason is because of what we call emergence. So consider the example of this university. Yes, this university needs lots of pieces. It needs all of you, it needs the buildings, it needs the whatever documents govern the university. And if all of them were to disappear, yes, the university would disappear. But think about it another way. Every year, some students leave, others come, some professors leave, others come. Maybe at some point in the future, the university will move to another part of Tijuana or even to another city. You never know. My university in Egypt did this in 2008. It moved from downtown Cairo, Egypt, all the way to the desert. It was still the same university, even though all the buildings were different. So emergence is what happens when a new thing emerges that is more than its parts. And this is what the underminers cannot account for. How it is that the Autonomous University of Baja California remains the same university in some sense, even 100 years from now when nobody is still here. And maybe the buildings are completely different in 100 years. You can still call it the same university in some sense. And so the parts do not have priority over the whole. Undermining is wrong. That's the first thing I wanted to say, that undermining does not work. It tries to go below objects, but it cannot explain that the objects are still there even when the pieces change. All right, now I want to put up a new word that does not exist in English. This is overmining. Actually, the word does exist in English, but it means something different. It means mining too much in one place and taking all the minerals out. You've done it too much. But that's not how I use it. I use it as the opposite of undermining, meaning that instead of saying objects are too shallow, we go below objects to get the tiny pieces. You say objects are too deep. Who ever saw these objects? All we ever see are events, or we see images in our mind, or all we encounter is language, or all we encounter is a power struggle, and objects are a derivative of the power struggle, or just about almost any modern idea is an overmining idea. This idea that objects are not too shallow and we go below, they're too deep, we go above. Starting with Descartes, but certainly in Kant. This idea that we cannot get at the thing in itself. We're talking only about appearances, the transcendental structure of appearances, of the phenomena. There's no talking about an object. At least Kant agrees that there is a thing in itself there, but he doesn't say much about it in his philosophy. Or consider my favorite living philosopher, Bernard Latour. Some people think of him more as an anthropologist or sociologist. Latour is one of the founders of actor network theory. Actor network theory says if you want to know what a thing is, look at what it does. A thing is its actions, nothing more. And so what am I? I am the person giving this lecture to Juana right now. That's all I am. And whatever other things I'm doing. My heart is beating. My money is earning small amounts of interest in the bank as I speak. All the other things I am doing. Combine those all of my actions, that is what I am. I am an actor, according to Bernard Latour. All right, well, what is the problem with these theories? These theories cannot explain change. And Aristotle noticed this a long time ago. If you've recently read Aristotle's Metaphysics, there's a place where he is critiquing the Megarian philosophers who come from Megara, close to Athens, to the west of Athens. The Megarians thought you're not a house builder unless you are building a house right now. Everything is only what it actually is. And so if I'm a master house builder and I am sleeping, I'm not a house builder. If I'm a master house builder eating lunch, I'm not a house builder. I have to be building the house right now. Now you may remember Aristotle said this is absurd, because obviously a master house builder is asleep, is more of a house builder than I am, even if I'm trying to build the house and failing. This is what led Aristotle to introduce his concept of dynamis, or potentiality. A thing is more than what it's currently doing. And there may be some problems with the concept of potentiality, but he's on the right track there. There needs to be a surplus in things, a reality that is not always expressed. So, for example, I can speak German, but I'm not going to speak any German in this lecture. I'm still a German speaker. I can speak a little French. I'm not going to speak any French in this. I spoke a few words in French, but I'm not going to speak very much French. Doesn't matter. You can still call me a German speaker or a French speaker, even if I'm not speaking those languages at all today. Aristotle would call them potential. All right, so overmining is the idea that you don't need this idea of objects. You only need to look at actions, events, appearances, and be suspicious of anything that's hiding underneath. And you find this in most modern and postmodern thinkers, whether it's Derrida, Husserl, Bruno Latour, Alfred North Whitehead, another philosopher I like. Similar to Latour, he thinks the relations between things are what is real. So we have undermining and overmining. Now what usually happens is that the two of them combine together to destroy objects. And I had to invent what I thought was a completely new word. I remember where I was in Brazil. I was in a hotel in Sao Paulo, and I said, I need a word to cover cases where people do undermining and overmining simultaneously. And so, of course, I thought of dual mining first as the obvious suggestion for that. And so I immediately searched for dual mining on Google, because actually I don't like inventing new words. It always seems artificial. I like to use words that already exist, even if they're rare, and put them to new use. And as it turned out, I was happy. Dual mining already exists. It is used by credit cards. Dual mining means text mining and data mining you to find out as much information about you as possible. And it's actually pretty scary what they can do. I read once that credit card companies can predict 3 years in advance with 80% accuracy, will you get divorced? I don't know how they do it, but something about changes in spending habits predicts a divorce. You might not even think you're going to get a divorce, but the credit card companies have a good idea that you will. So they're very effective in this sinister way, undermining and overmining you. They call it dual mining. And so I like that. I like this idea that it's already out there and it's already a negative word for the invasion of privacy. And in a way, dual mining in philosophy is also invading the privacy of the object. It's reducing the object to its pieces, or reducing an object to its effects. Now, what else is left? Some people might say that's all you can do. These are the two forms of knowledge. If somebody asks you what something is, like if I hold this up and I said, what is this? There are two kinds of answers you can give. There are only two kinds of knowledge available to humans. You can tell me what this is made of. You can say it's a plastic thing with ink inside, or you can tell me what it does. It's used for writing on the board. I've thought about this for years, and I think there is no other kind of knowledge. Knowledge is either saying what a thing is made of or saying what it does. It's either undermining or overmining. And that's fine. We need knowledge to survive. We need this for medicine. We need this for engineering. We need this for economics. We need to know what things are made of and what they do. So we're not trying to eliminate knowledge. We are simply saying that knowledge is not the whole of cognition. There is another kind of cognition that is not a knowledge. It doesn't involve telling what a thing is made of or what it does. Do I have any examples of this? Yes, I have two very good examples. Let's start with philosophy itself. Is philosophy really a kind of knowledge? I say no. I say the idea that philosophy is a kind of knowledge is a modern mistake inspired by the great success of the mathematical natural sciences, which are a kind of knowledge. That by overmining material reality, as Descartes and Galileo started to do, by expressing its movement in terms of mathematical equations, formalizing the movement of things, that's probably the most important thing that's happened in human history. It has opened up a whole scientific and technological revolution. And so philosophy has felt somewhat inferior to this and has tried to become a kind of knowledge in its own right. If the sciences can be knowledge, philosophy should be scientific. Right? There are many analytic philosophers who think this way. Even in continental philosophy, however, there are people like Alain Badiou, who thinks of philosophy as ontology as purely mathematical. Or Quentin Meillassoux, I think some of you are reading, who's my own age. Meillassoux thinks the primary qualities of things are the ones that can be mathematically determined. There's a problem with this, though. Don't forget Socrates, who I would call the first Western philosopher. Socrates is most famous for saying the only thing he knows is he knows nothing. He's never been anyone's teacher. And other sayings of this kind. If you read any Platonic dialogue, you will never gain knowledge about anything. You don't find out what virtue is, what friendship is, what love is, what beauty is. All of the answers people give to these in Plato's dialogues are undermined, let's say. They're destroyed. None of the definitions work. There is not one dialogue of Plato where at the end Socrates gives a valid definition. He gets closer to it. And of course we know the word philosophia. Even the etymology of the words, philosophy is about the love of wisdom. It's not about a claim to have any knowledge, the way the sciences and mathematics can claim to have knowledge. Or even the way that social sciences can claim to have knowledge, by mathematizing our understanding of politics or of economic data. Economics, of course, a very mathematical discipline, is a sort of overmining, and that's great. It gives us knowledge about how the economy works. Philosophy doesn't really give us knowledge about anything. It gives us a love of the wisdom. And not just Socrates, of course, but also in Nicholas of Cusa, at the very beginning of modern philosophy, learned ignorance, docta ignorantia, is this idea of knowing without knowing. In Plato's Meno, there is the famous case of Meno's paradox, as we call it in English at least. Zeno's paradox is the idea that you cannot look for something if you have it, and you cannot look for it if you don't have it. Because if I already have, let's say, courage, I don't need to look for it because I already have it. But if I don't know what it is already, I won't know it when I find it. And so it's a paradox created by the sophists to say there's no point looking for anything. But these are two extreme possibilities, and they both miss the third possibility in the middle, which is Filosofía. You have some idea of what courage is, but you don't yet know exactly what it is. And this is why you search. So I would criticize the usual attempt to link philosophy with any form of knowledge, whether it be mathematics, the natural sciences, or anything else, on the grounds that Socrates did the same. And so I'm simply going back to ask, what was the original sense of Filosofía in Socrates? Now, some people will say, this is nonsense because you'll end up with nothing but negative theology. You might remember negative theology in such figures as Pseudo-Dionysius is about saying what God is not. You cannot say what he is. God is too great to be described in positive terms. So you can only say God has no body, God has no intelligence in the human sense because he's above that. God has no spatial location. You narrow it down by saying what God is not. But in fact, those are, again, not the only possibilities. Our statements are not just positive or negative. We say things indirectly, elusively, in the form of innuendo, in the form of hints. This is a large part of our communication with each other. We hint at things without saying them explicitly. Aristotle, again, in the Rhetoric, he says this is what rhetoric is about. Right? Rhetoric is about the enthymeme, if you remember this term. The enthymeme is something you don't have to say because it's left implied in what you're saying. So let's say I'm in ancient Greece, and I'm saying this man, Professor Philippe Lee, has been 3 times crowned with laurel. What does that mean in ancient Greece? It means he has won the Olympics 3 times. But all Greeks know that the man who wins the Olympics gains a crown of laurel leaves. So I don't have to say it. And it's more powerful to leave it implied than to say it outright. What's the best example of this? You've probably all seen the movie The Godfather. It's a great movie about the mafia in New York. And this great phrase, I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. What does that mean? Well, we know it means something very bad. What does he actually do in the film? At the very beginning, he wants the Hollywood director to give his friend the parts in the movie. And the director says no. And so he has a beautiful racehorse. He cuts off the racehorse's head and puts it in his bed. And he wakes up and there's blood all over the bed and the horse's head is there. What if instead of saying, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse, he said, I'm going to cut off your horse's head and put it in your bed at night? It's disgusting, but it's not frightening the way hinting is frightening. Hints are always scarier. There was a terrible example from Dick Cheney that I just learned about. When Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense back in 1991 under the first President Bush, this was at the time of the first Iraq War. And there were rumors going around that Saddam Hussein is going to use chemical weapons against the American soldiers. And Dick Cheney wanted to scare the Iraqis not to do that. And so what did he say to Saddam? He sent a letter to Saddam Hussein. What did it say? Something terrible, but something that is a very effective threat. He said, if Iraq uses chemical weapons against American soldiers, the United States will respond promptly and decisively in a manner from which it will take Iraq centuries to recover. Which is it's an inhumane thing to say, but it's much better as a threat than saying, if you use chemical weapons, we will use nuclear weapons. Because then you're giving it away. You're saying in explicit propositional terms what we will do. And that's always less scary, no matter what it is, than a very vague, unstated threat. What about jokes? If you want to ruin a joke, simply state it in literal terms. I have a rotating list of examples I use. Which one should I use today? I'll use the joke today about Chinatown in San Francisco. A man goes into a shop in Chinatown, and he's looking at all the items. And he finds a rat made of brass. And he says, how much does this rat cost? And the owner of the shop says, $10 for the rat but $10,000 for the story behind the rat. And he said, I'll just pay the $10. So he buys the rat. And he walks out of the store and rats start following him. And so he starts running, looking behind him. There's hundreds of rats, thousands of rats, all chasing him. And he's running faster and faster, but there's more rats coming from the sewer, and finally there are close to 1 million rats. And so he climbs up the telephone pole next to the water. And the rats start chewing up the pole and chasing him. And so he takes the rat and throws it in the water. And all of the rats jump in and drown. And so he goes back to the store, and the store owner is smiling and says, I think you want to buy that story now, right? For $10,000. And he says, no, I just want to know if you have any brass lawyers. Okay, now let's say you're telling that joke and there's a child here. The child doesn't understand the joke. You have to explain it to them. You say, well, people don't like lawyers because they think lawyers take too much money and they entangle you in all kinds of complications. And so the man didn't even care about knowing why the rat was being chased by the real rats. He just wants to kill all the lawyers he knows. Also, imagine you want to ruin the joke. I thought of 3 ways you can ruin this joke. One way is to give the joke a backstory, explain the story. Start the joke by saying, a man in San Francisco was in a really bitter divorce, and his wife hired a really mean lawyer, and that lawyer took away all his money. And then he walks into the store. That's stupid now, right? Because then it's just a kind of silly revenge. He's mad that his wife got all his money from this lawyer. So it's not funny anymore. It's only funny when it's sudden and there's no reason for it. Okay, or let's say the joke ends with the man saying, yes, I do have a brass lawyer. And he sells him a brass lawyer for $10. And he walks out and all the lawyers start chasing him. And he starts running and more lawyers are chasing him. And he climbs up the pole, the lawyers are chasing, and he throws it in and it drowns. That's silly. That would ruin the joke. The final way you can ruin the joke is that the man comes back into the store and the shopkeeper says, I think you want to buy that story for $10,000 now. And he says, no, I just want to know if you have any brass carpenters. Why? Because nobody hates carpenters as far as I know, right? It's not funny again. So in order to be a funny joke, and it's not that funny, but it's a little bit funny, everything has to be said without explanation. You have to leave a lot of things in the joke that aren't explained. Or magic tricks. You go to see a magician. They're doing all these tricks. And at the end you go up and, I demand to know how you did all those tricks. I demand. I know their tricks. Tell me how you did them all. What I didn't know is that magicians around the world have an agreement with each other never to share the tricks with people outside. Because obviously the excitement of watching a magician is seeing these tricks happen for no reason. So it's not about negative theology, it's about hinting. It's about speaking in a kind of language that is not just clear propositions about the truth, but statements that hint at what the reality is. And as I mentioned, a lot of our communication is already about this. Metaphor being a good example. It's well known that you cannot take a metaphor and explain it in prose terms. Just like you cannot take a globe of the world and flatten it to 2 dimensions on a map. It's mathematically impossible. So too, you cannot take a metaphor and put it in literal terms. So imagine Homer in the Iliad or the Odyssey. Homer talks a lot about the wine dark sea. What does that mean? Well, you could say wine dark sea means the Mediterranean Sea is dark just like wine and it's the same color if you compare them. No, that's stupid. That's not what the metaphor is saying. The metaphor is saying more than that. The metaphor is also trying to say that the sea is dangerous like wine, it's intoxicating like wine. You can never exactly say in prose what the metaphor means. Literary critics have known this for 60 or 70 years. What about a literary work itself, or what about a painting? Again, you cannot explain those in literal terms. Art. No artwork can be replaced by a description of the artwork. Imagine reading a book about, let's say, Picasso or Cézanne, and there were no illustrations. It was just somebody trying to explain what each of the paintings looks like. There would be something wrong. You would not learn enough from that art book. You need to actually see the painting for yourself, see the sculpture for yourself, see the installation art for yourself. It cannot be replaced by prose. And this is what reality is like. Reality cannot be replaced by a set of descriptions. So art and philosophy are together in this way, as is architecture and some other disciplines, which are not primarily producing knowledge. Yes, you could learn something from a painting, you could learn something from a building, you could learn something from a philosopher, but it's not primarily knowledge that they're producing. This is obvious in the case of an artist, right? An artist is producing works. They're not producing knowledge about those works. Usually, the better an artwork is, the more different interpretations it can have. So, picture some of the greatest masterpieces of Cubism, whether it's Picasso or Braque. The greater they are, the more different interpretations scholars can have of them. Or let's say Shakespeare, or let's say Don Quixote. All of these works are interpreted again and again because they're among the greatest, which means it is harder to explain them in prose terms. What the critic does not provide knowledge. The critic tries to hint at what is behind the knowledge they're producing. Isn't food criticism like this? Isn't theater criticism like this? And my favorite example, wine criticism. You all probably know about Daniel Dennett, who is one of the most reductive philosophers in America. I love and hate this essay he has called Quinqualia, where in this essay, Dennett is making fun of wine tasters. He imagines a wine taster, or Coca-Cola taster. By the way, we say in the States, the Coca-Cola is better in Mexico, and I think it is. Right, because I think you use sugar instead of corn syrup. And maybe the formula is the original formula. This is better. I'm glad I got it. That's why I wanted to try it. Say you drink the wine and you say, a flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina. That's the example Dennett makes fun of. He says, this is ridiculous. You want to know what wine is? You take the wine, you pour it in a machine, and the machine gives the chemical formula. That is scientific wine tasting. Now, we know this is undermining. In my term, you're just replacing the taste of the wine with the chemical formula for the wine. It's also possible to have an overmining wine criticism, where you say, this wine makes me feel happy. This wine makes me feel free. All you're doing then is reducing the wine to its subjective effect on you. The wine critic, the professional wine critic, is trying to give you something more objective than that, not just how it makes them feel. But they're also not undermining it. They're not giving a chemical formula. They are flamboyant and velvety, lacking in stamina. These are poetic terms. And yes, some wine tasters are pretentious and silly, but some of them are very good. Just like some literary critics are very good, even if others are pretentious and silly. And so we learn which critics to respect in each area the most. And we can also improve our own taste. You can take a wine tasting course and learn how to taste better, or beer tasting, or food tasting. I'm improving my taste as an architectural critic. I came to architecture school knowing nothing about architecture. I've had to learn. And I'm getting better every year. More objective in my taste for which buildings are better than others. At first it was just sort of random. Which ones make me feel better? Now I'm getting better at it. So this is an example of why object-oriented ontology sees aesthetics as much more important in philosophy than most philosophers think. We would put aesthetics at the center. Why? Because aesthetics is not about putting things in prose language. It's even Kant in the Critique of Judgment talks about how you cannot explain beauty using concepts. It's about taste. And we agree with Kant on that there's no way to put things directly in prose terms, and this is why aesthetics is the center of philosophy. And I'll say more about this in a minute. All right, so that's the end of my first part. I could even speed up a little now, maybe. Am I talking at the right speed? Or too fast? It's good? Okay, thank you. Now, I said before that most Western philosophy and most Western thought either undermines or overmines or dual minds. Most philosophy is anti-object oriented. It tries to destroy the object and give us its parts, or it tries to destroy the object and give us its effects. Not all philosophy is like this. I can think of at least 4 traditions in the history of philosophy that have respected objects, but not enough to satisfy me. The first, of course, of these traditions is Aristotle's tradition of substances, primary substances. Unlike Plato, Aristotle can be said to put individual things, individual substances, at the basis of his philosophy. However, in Aristotle's tradition, it's usually a matter of natural things, not artificial things. And you can see this in Leibniz, who's Aristotle's maybe most important modern follower, where he distinguishes between substance and aggregates. And so for Leibniz, a flower can be a substance, but not a circle of men holding hands. If everybody in this room holds hands in a circle, that's just an aggregate. Each of us is an individual person, but all the people together in a circle is not a substance. There's no monad. He says one diamond is a substance, but two diamonds glued together is not a substance. Now that's a strange one, because one diamond is not really found in nature. It's very ugly in nature. You have to cut it and polish it, and so it's already very artificial. And then my favorite example, Professor Felipe Lee held up my book, Materialism, because Leibniz also makes fun of the Dutch East India Company, right? Because the Dutch East India Company is it's the first corporation. It has many ships, many workers, many islands that it owns. It did a lot of different things, caused a lot of events. But Leibniz doesn't think it can be one thing. I tried to show in my book, Materialism, why the Dutch East India Company is one thing. So, that tradition cannot really explain airplanes or computers or any of those as one thing, because they are aggregates. Or what about NAFTA, which is in the news a lot? NAFTA, I would say, is one thing. It's made of 3 countries. It's still one thing, because that one thing has effects on all 3 of the countries. They have to respond to it in different ways. Or the European Union. These can also be single objects for me, even though they have parts. Just like this ring is one thing, even though it has many parts of metal in it. So that's the first tradition in philosophy that respects objects. And I've said why Aristotle's tradition is great, but it cannot tell us enough about compounds, entities with lots of parts, or artificial entity. The next tradition, of course, is Immanuel Kant with his thing in itself, the Ding an sich, that can be thought but not known. It's amazing how unpopular Kant's thing in itself has become. I can only think of a handful of philosophers since Kant who have defended it. Schopenhauer defends it, Heidegger in one passage defends it, but most of the time people are saying, oh, that was Kant's most stupid idea. Right? All the German idealists say this, Nietzsche says this. They think this is his leftover Platonism, his leftover Christianity. They don't take it seriously. I take it very seriously. I happen to think Kant is right about the thing in itself, as I will say in a moment. But what's wrong with Kant's tradition? What's wrong with Kant's tradition of the thing in itself is that it's always a thing in itself for humans. It's that we poor human beings are so finite that we cannot reach the thing in itself. What about objects touching each other? The example I often use from Islamic philosophy, which I taught in Cairo, is fire burning cotton. Islamic philosophers love this example in the Middle Ages. Fire is burning cotton. Some of them say, actually, no, God is burning the cotton. The fire is just the occasion for God to burn the cotton. This is the first occasionalism, centuries before the French occasionalism of Malebranche. So, what about when one object touches another? I say there's a thing in itself there as well, a Ding an sich. The fire does not touch all the qualities of the cotton. Right? The fire only touches some features of the cotton. Its flammability. The fire has no idea of the whiteness of the cotton, the softness of the cotton, the price of the cotton. The fire and the cotton are just as finite as we humans are. Finitude has nothing to do with human consciousness. Simply to be an object is to be finite, and to enter into relation is always to translate the thing you are relating to. You'll never touch anything directly. Okay, the third tradition. The third tradition that enjoys objects starts with Alfred North Whitehead and continues today in Bruno Latour, among others. In this tradition of Whitehead, Process and Reality, the world is made of actual entities, he says, but they are defined by their relations to other entities. So here I am, as an entity, I am defined by my relations to all of you, and to the table, and to my parents, and to all of this. So every second my relations change, I'm actually a new person. It just seems like I'm the same person. Actually, I'm a different one. This is why Bruno Latour calls objects actors, because it's their actions, their relations to other things. And again, I said the problem with this tradition is it's an overmining tradition. You cannot explain change if you think a thing is only its relations and only its actions. Okay, I have a certain relation to all of you, but 4 days from now I'll be teaching my students in Los Angeles and I'll have a very different relation to all of you. I might be in your memories, I might not. Instead, I'll be standing in front of the architecture students in Los Angeles. So my relations are changing, but 4 days from now I will be the same person, more or less, despite some changes in my relations. We could say it's the same person. Finally, the tradition of phenomenology, which is the one I use most, it is not realized that this is a great object-oriented tradition, a very great one. And in fact, object-oriented ontology develops from phenomenology in both Husserl's sense and Heidegger's sense. And this is going to be the second part of the lecture, and I'm trying to time it just right. Well, let me start with Heidegger, because my philosophy began when I was a graduate student. I was writing my doctoral thesis on the famous tool analysis in Being and Time, which everybody knows. It's a famous analysis. And if you think of the tool analysis in Heidegger as coming against the background of Husserl's phenomenology, Husserl thinks the way to do philosophy is to focus on appearances, focus on phenomena, and describe exactly in great detail what you experience. Don't invent scientific theories or other theories about what you see. Simply describe the phenomena very accurately and try to determine the essence of everything you experience. Of course, Heidegger's objection to this, from a surprisingly young age, was that most of the things we deal with in the world are not in our conscious minds. A good example being the floor of this room. Nobody was thinking of the floor until I mentioned it just now, probably, right? None of you. But you needed it. You were taking the floor for granted. If the floor disappears, you fall. You're injured or killed. Falling into the, if there's a basement here, I don't know, but if there is, you fall to the basement of this building. Or if there's an earthquake, then you notice the floor because it's shaking. Or if the floor is sticky and you feel that it's sticky, you can't move your shoes, maybe you notice the floor. Most of the time you were not. You were probably not thinking about the air in this room until I mentioned it. Unless you're having a hard time breathing, you're not thinking of the air. You probably were not thinking of your heartbeats right now, unless you have a medical condition and you're worried about your heart. You just rely on your heart to beat. You don't think about it. So, for Heidegger, what's most important are these things in the background. These invisible things that usually we only notice when they go wrong. When we're hammering and the hammer breaks, or the hammer is too heavy, or I'm getting a blister and it's hurting me to hammer, then we notice the hammer. Most of the time, however, the hammer is invisible. We're thinking about what we build with it. We're thinking about the house, what we plan to do in the house. So this is just a basic summary of Heidegger's major objection to Husserl's phenomenology. We'll return to Husserl in a few minutes. We're on Heidegger now. And in my dissertation, this was back in 1992 that it took me years to finish it, but I was starting it in about 1992. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write a dissertation for my doctoral thesis that shows that the tool analysis explains all of Heidegger's philosophy. I still think it does. That all of his concepts have to be explained in terms of this tool analysis. And this is already going to be radical. Heidegger scholars don't like it, even now in 2018. I thought this will be a good dissertation. It will be a little controversial. But then I started working on it and found some more strange things. Here's one of the strange things I discovered. Very often, people interpret Heidegger's tool analysis to say that there is this big opposition between theory and practice. Right? That before you can look at anything or make a theory about it, you have to be using it unconsciously. After a few years, I noticed there's a problem with that. The problem with that is that practice is not really a closer relationship to things than theory. So to give an example, my wife is a food scientist, and so she can analyze this Coca-Cola, she can put it in a machine, she can tell me things about this. Like what it's made of, what its health properties are. That's a theoretical understanding of the Coca-Cola. I know nothing about food science, so I just drink it, I use it. I have a practical relation to the Coca-Cola. I drink it, I enjoy it, it satisfies my thirst. So, according to that interpretation of Heidegger, we have to be enjoying the Coca-Cola before we understand it. Yes, but using the Coca-Cola as a drink is not really any closer to the cola than studying it is. Because what happens? In the case of Heidegger complains about theoretical understanding, that any theoretical knowledge of the cola distorts it or translates it away from its original form. Coca-Cola, there's a being to the Coca-Cola, as for everything, and it withdraws into darkness. It is veiled, it is concealed. This is kind of a trivial example, but you can imagine an example of a Greek temple or something else. It's always hidden or concealed. But when I use the Coca-Cola, isn't the same thing happening? It's also concealed. I have human taste, I don't have dog taste or mosquito taste. And so I'm humanizing the Coca-Cola when I drink it. Even though I'm not thinking about it or studying it, I'm still humanizing it. I'm reducing it to human terms by tasting it. So what it seemed to me at that point is that Heidegger is really showing us that there are objects deeper than any human contact, whether it's practical, theoretical, or anything. Every human relation to an object translates it into something different. And I was there for a while. I stayed there for a while. And I think I could persuade Heidegger of that if he were alive. That theory versus praxis is not really a very deep distinction. It looks like it is, and a lot of philosophy is based on this distinction today. But it's not really a very deep distinction. Theory and praxis are both human relations to the world. The difference between conscious and unconscious is not that important for ontology. It might be important for psychology, but not for philosophy. And then after a few more years, I took a much more unusual step, which is to realize, hey, objects do this to each other also. And that's when people started saying this is crazy, right? Because modern philosophy is based on the idea that you cannot talk about the relation between objects except insofar as it manifests to humans, in science, for example. So in Kant's philosophy, for example, I cannot talk about fire burning cotton. I can only talk about humans observing fire burning cotton. I can't know what it's like when fire in itself burns cotton in itself. I think this is wrong. I think this is where philosophy after Kant took a wrong turn. I think the history of philosophy has crossroads where things could go this way or that. And I think the period right after Kant is one of the great crossroads. And let me explain why. What was the usual critique of Kant in his lifetime and after? It was that of the German idealists. It was that of Fichte and Hegel and some other figures such as Solomon Maimon. We're trying to say that Kant is a great genius, but where did he get this silly idea about things in themselves? Because of course, if I say there is a thing outside thoughts, well, I'm thinking about it when I say it, so I'm contradicting myself. I cannot say there's a thing outside thoughts because I'm using thought to say it, and therefore I'm trapped in this circle. And this is the road to German idealism, and to most philosophy in the West since then. This idea that you cannot gain any access to a thing in itself out there. As mentioned, there are only a tiny handful of philosophers who defend the thing in itself. Almost everyone agrees that it's a terrible idea, and I don't. I think it's a good idea. That is one side of Kant's. That is the side of Kant that German idealism radicalized and said there's no thing in itself. But there's another thing that could have happened. Instead of saying Kant was a great philosopher except for this stupid Ding an sich, or thing in itself, we could have said Kant is a great philosopher precisely because of the thing in itself. But why did he limit it to human beings? Why do we not say that when fire burns cotton, the cotton is a thing in itself for the fire only touches some of the qualities? This actually would have been much more revolutionary. We could have had German realism instead of German idealism. And it was possible because, remember, the influence of Leibniz. And Leibniz had this seemingly crazy theory in which all kinds of monads affect each other. That could have been a possible path in history. And if that had happened, civilization would be very different today. There would have been no Marxism, for example, because there would have been no Hegel to be radicalized by Marx. There would have been no Nietzsche in the way we know him. There would have been no pragmatism. There would have been no other idealist philosophies of the 20th century. Instead, we'd still be in this post-Kantian realism that doesn't exist, instead of a post-Kantian idealism that does exist. In a way, object-oriented ontology is simply German realism happening 200 years later than it should have, except it's not German anymore. It's mostly in the United States. But in a way, we're just taking the other road that was not taken after Kant. So what do we have in Heidegger? What do we have in Heidegger when the tool breaks? We have the hammer. You're working with the hammer, suddenly it breaks. What happens in that case? Well, it's not that the hammer suddenly becomes deeply visible to you. The being of the hammer is still hidden from you. What happens is that certain qualities of the hammer become noticed that you didn't notice before. You're thinking of the hammer, you're thinking of certain qualities of the hammer. That it's made of wood, the wood is giving you a blister, it's heavy, it's too heavy, so you have to stop hammering. And these things are pointing towards a hammer that you cannot see, a kind of essence of the hammer or being of the hammer that is always hidden, whether it's broken or not. The hammer I call a real object, because it's an object, it's a unified thing. It's real because it's there whether we like it to be there or not. But it's also withdrawn in Heidegger's sense. It's veiled, it's hidden, it's concealed. This is Heidegger's major idea, of course. The idea that being always hides behind the appearances. Then you have the qualities of the hammer which are visible. I call them the sensual qualities because the senses can make contact with them. They're not hidden the way the hammer itself is. I can describe them and so forth. This, I say, is the diagonal line that also happens in the case of artworks. At the bottom, I made up a metaphor that's the opposite, sea dark wine. Sea dark wine is also a metaphor. Homer never uses it. And this shows why metaphors are not reversible. Right? Wine dark sea and sea dark wine are not the same metaphor. The first one is about the sea, it has wine qualities. The second one is about the wine, it has sea qualities. What this means is that metaphorical language, unlike literal language, is broken in half. So if I were to say a pen is like a pencil, that's boring, right? It's not a metaphor, it's a literal statement. I could also say a pencil is like a pen. It means the same thing. Any literal statement can be reversed, and it means exactly the same as it meant in its original form. Why? Because in a literal statement, you are simply comparing the qualities of things and saying they are the same. A pen is like a pencil, or a pencil is like a pen. You can write with both of them. It doesn't matter. But wine dark sea and sea dark wine are not reversible. They're two different metaphors. What this means is that the metaphor has two sides. One of them is the subject term, and one of them is the qualities term. In the case of wine dark sea, what happens is the sea is up there on the upper left-hand corner. The sea is the real object you're talking about, and it has wine qualities, and it naturally repels those qualities because sea has sea qualities in literal language. It doesn't have wine qualities. So what you get in the case of the metaphor is you get the sea up there and the wine qualities down here. So this is what art does. Art gives you an object that cannot be explained in literal terms or in prose terms. Even Marcel Duchamp's famous urinal, which looks like a literal object, becomes a non-literal object as soon as it's put in the art gallery. So it's not an artwork unless it somehow hides or withdraws from view. All right. So let me finish now with Husserl, because we were too quick in accepting Heidegger's criticism of Husserl. There's also something in Husserl going on that I think is unprecedented in the history of philosophy, and Heidegger pretty much misses it most of the time. What did David Hume think about objects in the world of the senses? Well, he thought that objects didn't really exist. British empiricism, not just Hume, but all of the empiricists, tend to think that I just see some qualities here. I see red and I see this brown liquid. I don't really see an object called Coca-Cola bottle. I just see all the different qualities, and I put them together with a nickname, Coca-Cola bottle. But all I really see are qualities. Just like the theory of names of Bertrand Russell claims that the name Harman is simply an abbreviation for all the true facts about me. It's the British tradition of treating things as bundles of qualities, sets of qualities. Well, Husserl completely turns this on its head. Husserl, in all phenomenology, say the object comes first. Why? Because look at this bottle. I turn it and I'm seeing different qualities every second. But it's always the same bottle. The qualities I see every second are the Abschattungen, the adumbrations, we call them in English. I don't know the Spanish term. The different sides of the bottle you're seeing as you turn it, or the different distances I hold. For Husserl, it's one and the same bottle. And so he discovers something that Hume had suppressed in his theory of perception. Husserl discovered perception is made of objects, not just qualities. And those objects stay the same. No matter how they no matter what side I see them from, no matter how much light is shining on it, no matter what kind of good or bad mood I am in when I see the bottle, the object remains the same. And so you have a tension in Husserl between the sensual object, because he doesn't believe in the thing in itself. He thinks this object is seen by me. It's not hiding. But then you also have the qualities. So you have this tension there. These two are holding together. That's the first step. Now there's another weird thing going on in Husserl, however. What does Husserl want you to do? If you're doing a phenomenological analysis of this Coca-Cola bottle, you're supposed to find the essence of it, right? So let's say, is the label essential? No, because I can tear it off, right? I won't try it now, but I could tear off the label and throw it away. Does it have to be full to be a Coca-Cola bottle? No, because I can have it all the way down or even gone. And by going this way, you will eventually come to the essence of the Coca-Cola bottle that it needs. So if I put this in a shredder and put it into a million pieces, then it's obviously not a Coca-Cola bottle. So it needs some kind of physical integrity. It needs certain shape. It should have Coca-Cola in it instead of lemonade. It should have this label on it, this cap on it. But this is a different kind of quality. Now, Husserl thinks these are perceived with your senses on the bottom, and these are perceived with your mind. I think that's impossible. Because anything that's real, anything which is in itself, is not graspable by the mind any more than by the senses. Again, the difference between theory, cognition, and sensation is not an important difference for object-oriented ontology. Just like the difference between theory and practice is not an important difference for object-oriented ontology. So, let me draw that crossing X a little better. 1 second. So you see we have three relations here that involve a tension between one kind of object and its qualities. The idea is that an object both has and does not have its qualities, right? Because again, yes, you can say this has a label, but if I tear off the label and throw it away, it's still a Coke bottle. It just doesn't have the quality of the label. And so does having the label belong to a Coke bottle or not? Well, yes and no. It both does and doesn't have it. Just like being a philosophy professor both belongs to me and doesn't belong to me. Maybe I get fired, maybe I quit and do something else next year. In one sense, it's important to who I am to be a philosophy professor. In another, it could change. Objects both have and do not have their own qualities. That is one of the central principles of object-oriented ontology. And as you'll see tomorrow, our method in most fields involves trying to drive a wedge between objects and their qualities. See what happens. And so, for example, in the book about the Dutch East India Company, I tried to imagine which things were important, which things were unimportant for the company to continue to be what it was. And I'm going to talk about that book tomorrow. But I just want to point out that there's one more line missing. You probably see it. Do real objects have a tense relation with their own qualities? The answer is yes. We get this from Leibniz in the Monadology. There's a passage right at the beginning of the Monadology where Leibniz says, on the one hand, every monad is one. It's a unified thing. But on the other hand, every monad must have its own multiplicity of qualities, otherwise things would all be alike. Everything would just be a one, and a snowflake would be the same as a Coke bottle, would be the same as a flower, would be the same as anything for him. So we do have to add that fourth line. So we have 4 lines. It's a fourfold of our own. It's not that different from Heidegger's fourfold, I've tried to say. 4 tensions because there are 2 kinds of objects and 2 kinds of qualities. Every object has both real qualities and sensual qualities, and it both has them and does not have them. An object has a very loose relation with its own qualities. That's why metaphors can be done, which take qualities away from one object and put them on another. That's why causal relations can happen, which take qualities from one object and translate them to another. And anytime there's a tension between objects and their qualities, the term we use for that is aesthetics. Aesthetics is not just about art, it's the study of the troubled relation between objects and their own qualities. And this is why we say aesthetics is first philosophy. Aesthetics is at the center of philosophy. It doesn't just mean art is the center of all philosophy, although I do rate art very highly. It's about the fact that aesthetics allows us to explore the difficult relations that objects have between themselves and with their own qualities. And I just want to make 2 more points before I stop. One of them is that since we accept Heidegger's principle, or even Kant's principle, that the real thing is withdrawn from any contacts, it becomes a problem how things relate. How can things relate if they're withdrawing from each other? And so we use this term vicarious causation, which means something similar to occasional cause in the tradition, except there's a big difference. In the tradition, occasionalism was a religious philosophy. It meant that nothing can relate unless God comes and burns the cotton, or God, I think I'm picking this up, but actually God is picking it up for me. This actually goes way back to early Islam before it comes in through France into Western philosophy. The problem with that theory is not that God is in it and we should all try to get God out of philosophy and so forth. No, the problem with it is that it chooses anything as an exception. If nothing can touch anything else, why should God be able to do it? Well, in a way, Kant and Hume are doing the same thing as the occasionalists, except instead of saying that all causality is in God, they're saying all causality is in the human mind. In Hume's case, causation is a habit that we form through customary conjunction. In Kant's case, causation is one of the categories of the understanding that humans are imposing on the world. And we are saying neither God nor the human mind can be an exception. Everything has problems making relations with anything else. And so all causation is indirect. All causation between objects passes through a third term, which is qualities that they share. All causation between qualities happens through objects. I won't go further into that today, but we draw the consequence for a new way of trying to understand causation. The last point I want to make is that we have terms for these 4 lines. The one at the bottom is called time, because what really happens in the experience of what we call time? What happens is that we see certain objects enduring for a while their qualities change. If none of the qualities of anything were ever changing, we wouldn't notice the passage of anything like time at all. Time is what results from this tension between objects that are there and their qualities which are changing. So I sense time passing because I'm rotating this, or because the thoughts in my mind are subtly changing, or because all of you are moving a little bit. This is how we sense the passage of time. That axis, the diagonal one, is what we call space. Because what is space? Well, for one thing, all space is inferred. John Locke pointed this out. As you know from the case of babies think they can grab anything. So a baby probably thinks the people in the back are toys. and babies try to reach the moon. Space has to be inferred. We have to learn how to infer how far away are these people. They're not tiny toys, even though these two people look this big. I know that they are normal-sized humans who are far from me. That is learned. And these people themselves are hidden from me, just like all things in themselves are hidden from me, and yet they're somewhat accessible through the qualities that they are manifesting. It's a combination of distance and nearness of the kind Heidegger always writes about. So that is one we call space. Now this is interesting because we have four, and time and space are two of them. And everybody talks about time and space or space and time, but those two are always the only two that come as a pair. Nobody ever adds anything to the list of space and time. It's assumed that those are the two basic cosmological structures that we all live in. I say no. I say that since space and time come out of a certain relationship between objects and qualities, we have to place the other two lines on the same level as space and time. What are they? We call that one essence, because we're talking about real objects and the real qualities that belong to them, which are the essential qualities that the thing needs to be what it is. That is the essence. And a thing is not necessarily identical with its essence. Aristotle raised this question in the Metaphysics. Is a thing the same as its essence? It's not so clear. That leaves one line. And that was the last one to come to me, because it took me a long time to realize that Husserl is distinguishing between essential and accidental qualities of objects of the senses. And I used his own term for essence, which is eidos, the Greek word. And eidos is the strange one, because in it we have a sensual object, an object that exists only in the senses. Because I could be hallucinating a dragon right now, but that dragon still has real qualities, even though the dragon itself is not real. Because the dragon has hidden qualities that it needs to be that dragon. So, time, space, essence, and eidos. You will find this if you read my book, The Quadruple Object. These are the four basic structures of the world. They have an aesthetic status because they involve the unstable relation between an object and its own qualities. And most of the object-oriented method in every field involves applying these terms to ask what's going on in any given situation. So it's now about 1:20. Is this a good place to stop and ask questions?
You want to touch upon immaterialism, materialism?
Yes, thank you. I should have done that near the beginning. When I talked about undermining and overmining, and you remember what those were. Undermining thinks you explain a thing by talking about the pieces it's made of. Overmining talks about what a thing does. And dual mining is both at once. Well, in a sense, materialism is the philosophy that best exemplifies this. Traditional materialism, of course, was about finding the physical particles that everything is made of. That's the old kind of materialism. But there's a new kind of materialism, you may have noticed. They call it new materialism, which isn't really about atoms and hard physical stuff. It's about everything is socially constructed, everything is contingent, everything is about embodiments in the world, everything is about, it could be about power. Foucault is sometimes called a materialist. But Foucault is not really a materialist in the old sense, right? He's not interested in atoms or decomposing things into their physical parts. He's interested in the other kind of materialism, disciplinary practices and other things that shape who we are. So that's the overmining sort of materialism. And those are both very important. Like I said, all knowledge is important, and every kind of materialism is a knowledge. But if you're trying to avoid both of those reductions, the downward and the upwards, you need to talk about immaterialism. Now this term, in philosophy, this term usually is applied to Berkeley's absolute idealism, right? That there's nothing material, everything's just an image for a mind, for a human mind or for God's mind. That's of course not what we mean by it, because that would be just another overmining doctrine. Everything is just an image. What we mean by immaterialism is that what is between the undermining and the overmining is a form. And form, of course, usually means the outward look of a thing. But in the medieval context, it also meant the substantial form, right? The form that is really there in the thing that's different from the form that we see. And of course, this was kicked out of science, starting with Descartes, because Descartes thought physics was about simply describing the position and the speed of everything, not about any internal principle. And I'm not going to ask that science bring back substantial forms, but metaphysics, ontology can bring back substantial forms, because everything does have a nature as to what it is, and that nature is never fully visible. It's never fully shaped by its context. It's something deeper, and it's also never fully explainable by the pieces that the thing is made of. Or maybe it's explainable, but it's not the same as its pieces. I guess quantum chemistry is pretty good at predicting the properties of every chemical element. But even if it can predict it, the chemical element as a whole is something different from the pieces of it. And so there's emergence. And immaterialism for us is about finding these substantial forms that are in the thing. And of course you can't do that directly. You cannot translate a hidden thing in itself into prose terms, and so you hint at it indirectly. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Now I was going to save most of the materialism for tomorrow's lecture, but just to give you a hint, most history, I think, overmines things. It also undermines it, but history is a lot about overmining. Because if you're going to write the history of something, let's say you were going to write the history of the Dutch East India Company. You're going to find the things that it did that had the biggest impact, right? So you're going to focus on the biggest battles the Dutch East India Company fought, the biggest shipments of spice that it ever did, and so forth. But not every one of those is important to the internal existence of the company, right? Some of the biggest battles it fought did not make the biggest difference to the company. So I brought it, I don't want to spoil tomorrow, but I'll give you a little taste of it. There's this term symbiosis. This term comes from biology. It comes from an American woman named Lynn Margulis, who is one of the great scientists of the last 50 years. And if some of you might know about her, but if you don't, the traditional Darwinian theory of evolution, change of species is gradual, right? Big fish have a baby, and it eats the baby of the little fish, and so fish gradually get bigger and stronger and meaner. Evolution is supposed to take place very slowly in that way. There have always been some people who think evolution happens in jumps. There's Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, but the more interesting one to me is Lynn Margulis. What Lynn Margulis thought is that evolution happens when two life forms come together to form a new species. She theorized back in the 1960s that all the parts in the human cell, only some of them are naturally there. Others came from the outside. Right? It was some of the parts of our cells were actually independent bacteria or viruses that came into our cells as parasites way back in history. And then over time we needed them. We needed some of these to survive when the oxygen level increased or for some other reason. And so we formed a symbiotic relation where we reproduced these viruses and bacteria along with our own cells. And here's an example. When she was a student, she asked a very profound question of her professors. She was a student of biology, and she asked, did we ever see evolution happen in the laboratory in front of our eyes? And at the time, they said there's one case, just one case. They took fruit flies. What are fruit flies in Spanish?
Fruit flies.
Fruit fly? Oh, okay. Drosophila in Latin. I don't know if it's Spanish, but anyway. You know the fruit flies, these tiny little flies that they use in genetics. They put them all in a big tank, big glass tank, and they divide it down the middle. This side of the tank, they slowly raise the temperature. This side of the tank, they slowly lower the temperature. Just a little bit each day. And then after, 5 or 6 months, the fruit flies could no longer mate together. So they're different species now. And so they kill the fruit flies, the poor things, and dissect them. And they find that the hot fruit flies had a virus in them. And the scientists said, oh, that ruins the experiment. It's contaminated by a virus. Then Margulis said, no, that's the point. Why do you think they survived the heat? It's because they brought a virus in that enables them to survive the heat. That's why they became a different species. And so that evolution is actually it's rare. It only happens when two species come together to create a new organism. And I tried to apply this to history in the case of the Dutch East India Company. And I hypothesized that every historical object, whether it's a person, like your own life, or a historical institution, it will only go through really 5 or 6 changes. And it will come through a symbiosis. Think about your own life, no matter how old or young you are. Most of the changes that happen to you in your life, and I guess there's going to be around 5 or 6 important ones, are not because you're sitting around in your bedroom brooding about your life and who am I and how do I find myself, what am I? No, it's from something outside you, right? It's you get married, or you have a very special friend, or you join a profession, or you join a university. It's some connection you make with something outside of you that changes you irreversibly. So my connection with philosophy, or my connection with Cairo, Egypt, where I lived for 16 years in the middle of my life, cannot be reversed. I cannot go back to the person I was before philosophy or before Egypt. These are the things, it's going to be around a half dozen for reasons I haven't fully proven, but I'm pretty sure about that. And in the case of the Dutch East India Company, I tried to find the 5 or 6 major changes. And I started doing this by realizing that you're making a connection with a thing, not with an action. But we learn in school in America that a noun is a person, place, or thing, right? Nouns as a part of speech refer to a person, place, or thing. So what if we just assume that there's going to be about 2 people, 2 places, and 2 things on average? It's actually a little different in each case. I looked at that and I found that not all of the things that are important in the history of the Dutch East India Company actually transformed it. There are only a few. And it's either 5 or 6. I don't remember how many I came up with. There's 1 person only who changed the nature of the company. There are 2 places and 2 things, I think. And then maybe I added a 3rd thing. Well, I did, in my new book for Pelican, Object-Oriented Ontology, A New Theory of Everything, I did the same for the American Civil War. And some of the findings were not surprising, and some were. The unsurprising finding was that the two most important people in the American Civil War are General Grant and General Lee. Not very surprising. They're the leading Northern general, leading Southern general. They had a big fight at the end, with Grant winning, 1865. The surprising result was which battles are the most important. 2 battles I decided were the most important are not always the most famous ones. The most famous battle in that whole war was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This is where the South tried to invade the North and were defeated in 1863. It's the most famous, it lasted 3 days. If you ever go to Pennsylvania, you can visit this battlefield. This is where the South really is often said to have lost the war. But I argued that 2 other battles, one of them at Vicksburg, Mississippi, the other at Chattanooga, Tennessee, were actually the key to the war. Because those were cases where the war took on a different character that could not be reversed. The geography of the war completely changed after those 2. So as I said in the book, Gettysburg could have won or lost the war, but it could not have changed the war. The war changed only because of those other battles, Vicksburg, Chattanooga. And at some point, I want to write a longer book of history about something to show how this works. Next time I'll try to choose a non-violent example, because my 2 examples now are the first corporation that exploits Indonesians and then the American Civil War. So I feel like I'm turning into this ghoul of wars and battles and enslavement. I want to pick something that's very non-violent, and I'm looking for the right example, just to show that I can choose an example that doesn't involve fighting and killing. We'll see what it is. So that's how I try to use the immaterialist method. And so tomorrow I'll try to talk a bit about arts, architecture, history, politics, maybe a bit. Just show some applications of this method. Those of you who would like to come. So now it's 1:31. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate your coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And so we begin this section. If anyone has a commentary, question.
To go back not to the distinction between objects and qualities that you talk about today, but the distinction between the real and the sensual.
Yeah.
Because that's what bugs me a little bit. That maybe in your theory the sensual is like unreal, when you make this distinction. So I don't know if you can explain it in another way, because in that way time is not real, it's unreal, because it's a relationship between sensual objects and sensual qualities.
Right. Real has different senses, of course, because you could say these things are sensual, yet they're still real in a sense. I simply use the terminology real to mean the thing that exists, whether anybody is perceiving it or not, and therefore it is hidden, therefore it is different from whatever we perceive in it. But since it's you asking this question, I want to bring up Lacan, because I know you're interested in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And this explains the difference between object-oriented ontology and Zizek, for example, who's a follower of Lacan. Those are Lacan's three most famous terms, and since I know you know this, but not everybody in the room probably knows Lacan's theories. What's the difference between Freud and Lacan? Well, the biggest difference is, for Freud, the unconscious is a real thing that's hidden behind your surface actions, and from time to time it causes us to make a mistake, or causes us to lose something, or causes us to have dreams. But it's a real thing in the world, this unconscious, for Freud. For Lacan, no, it's not this real thing hidden outside. It happens in the gaps and the mistakes that happen at the level of the symbolic. The imaginary has to do with the mirror stage, when a baby at a certain age sees itself as a unified, wonderful, beautiful, desirable thing in the mirror. Even though inside it feels incompetent, it goes to the bathroom inside of its diaper, it can barely talk, it can't get food for itself, it's totally dependent on its mother. But when it sees itself in the mirror, it sees itself as a desirable thing. This is connected with narcissism. The symbolic has to do with language, with social positions, social rewards. And then there's the real, which is not enough of a real for me. And this is my difference from Zizek. You came up to see us debate last year. Because for the Lacanians, these three are always linked. You cannot remove one without destroying the whole structure. And so there isn't really a real world independent of the symbolic for the Lacanians. The real is the trauma that happens when you can't symbolize something, right? At least in Zizek's reading. The real is that which is... Trauma is the best way to say it. And so, therefore, the only real function of the real for Zizek and other Lacanians is to traumatize humans. And that's my objection to it. It's too much like Kant's thing in itself. Or even Kant's sublime in a way. It's something that overpowers us. It's not something that does things where parts of the real do things to each other. And parenthetically, let me say something about Merleau-Ponty, because I like Merleau-Ponty just like everybody. He has very good insights, and my background is in phenomenology. But Merleau-Ponty is one of those philosophers who's always called the philosopher of the future, right? That, Merleau-Ponty is already way out ahead of us, and if we can just catch up with him, we'll enter a completely new philosophy. Schelling is kind of like this too. At least in America, there's always a Schelling renaissance every 20 years or so. That Schelling is really more a philosopher of the future than Hegel. But Merleau-Ponty right now is really the big philosopher of the future. But there's a problem. Right? Merleau-Ponty says, we don't just look at the world looks back at us. Okay, that's nice, but it's not as new as it sounds, because it's still the human and the world as the two things that are looking at each other. What about parts of the world looking at each other? You don't get that in Merleau-Ponty. Why? Because he's in Kant's tradition. It's humans in one basket and everything else in the other basket. Black holes, bones, metals, stars, it's all over here. Dolphins is all in one basket, and then we humans get a whole half of the philosophy. That's Kant's real legacy, and that's the part of his legacy I don't like. I like the things in themselves. I don't like the idea that human beings deserve 50% of philosophy, because we're pretty minor in the end. Right? There's a huge universe out there, and we are a tiny speck of dust. I mean, we're interesting to ourselves, of course, but that doesn't mean we deserve half of all philosophy for ourselves. And so this is my problem with Merleau-Ponty, with Heidegger, Derrida, any of these figures. To me, it was Whiteheads who really opened up the possibility of talking about object-object relations in the same way as subject-object relations. And that's not surprising, because Whitehead calls himself a pre-Kantian. He says he's trying to go back to the 1600s. This was his favorite period.
But I think that making this distinction is responding in a way to this distrust in the sensual, in the appearances, as not sufficiently real. I don't know if we can talk about the sensual object being real, because you made in the first place this distinction.
Right. That's only though because if you accept that all experience is a translation, Derrida will try to say it's translation without an original. Right? There's nothing but translations, nothing but signs. This to me is an overmining strategy. It's saying that there is nothing hidden behind the play of the surface. And the problem with all the overmining strategies is they can't explain change. As Aristotle showed, they don't have a surplus there that allows new things to happen. And this is why I have to say there is a real that is somewhat discontinuous with the sensual. Except I'm saying that sensual objects have real qualities, which is the thing that surprises me most about my own philosophy. That was the shocking thing when I got to it. That Husserl really shows us that this apple, which is just a phenomenon, has real apple qualities, even if it's not really there. I can hallucinate a centaur or a dragon, but the dragon that I see still has real dragon qualities that give it the essence of a dragon. And so yes, that is one of the ways in which object-oriented ontology is more classical than most recent philosophies, which try to affirm the realm of appearances as being all there is, whether it's Nietzsche or Derrida. So yeah, we're more Aristotelian in that sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I changed.
Dark Deleuze?
No, that's not that one. I think it's obscure or dark objects or desired, if I can remember well. But on that text, he made the claim that the Kant that you base most of your lecture upon is the Kant of the critique of pure reason from 1791, but that you leave outside of your critique the Kant that you can find perhaps in the critical of practical reason or the critical of judgment. And he kind of make the argument that your Kant, especially when you try to establish the harsh distinction between the so-called critical Kant versus the post or critical Kant,
right,
per se, that this same distinction doesn't really apply to Kant himself, because he constantly violated this distinction, this artificial distinction in Kant's thought. So my question is if that's something that really happens in your theoretical approach to object-oriented ontology, or if it's only because Andrew's goal kind of misread you. Because we have a Kantian here who has been studying Kant for the past 30 years. I'm not sure if he's present or if he's actually in class, but I was hoping that we could discuss this more in depth if possible.
Yeah, I've met Andrew Culp, but I don't know that article, so there's a limit to how much I can respond to that. I want to read it now, though.
Okay.
But not having read it, I'll just say that I'm not sure how that's going to work, because the Kant of the ethical philosophy, there is a distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal self. Because on the phenomenal level, you can't explain all my actions in terms of the food I ate and my DNA. That's the problem. It's the moral self that is supposedly irreducible to that. So he does allow for both. As a phenomenon, we are pieces of matter just like anything else for Kant, and so therefore we can be scientifically explained. And yet there's this other self. That's the moral self, is ourselves as the thing in itself. So I'd be curious to see what his argument is. And then in the critique, I already use the third critique quite a bit in my new books. It's true, I haven't written much about the second critique. Not a lot, but in my book, Dante's Broken Hammer, I've talked about that a bit. So, what did you say the title was?
Dark Objects of Desire, if I can remember.
Dark Objects of the what?
Desire.
Oh, desire. Desire, yeah. Okay.
That's the title of the essay. I thought you had already read it.
No.
It came out like 2 or 3 years ago.
No, I've just read Dark Deleuze, and we did a lecture together this summer in Los Angeles. But I didn't know about this. Nice guy, though. I like Andrew.
Come on, don't be afraid.
So there's overmining and undermining, and there's dual mining. But like, what would you say would be mining then?
Mining is the term I use for all three of any of those three. So if you say mining, then you have to say what are the forms of mining: overmining, undermining, demining.
Can it be just mining?
No, there's no mining in general. That's just a category they all fit under. Yep. Sure.
I was wondering what was your relation to specifically Spinoza?
Mhm.
Because recently, what you were just saying near the end of the relation between objects, well, in Spinoza, well, it is considered how objects interact independently of subject and object, and even more so that there isn't, or it seems to me that there isn't neither an overmining or undermining, in as much as a thing, a mode, can be considered, yes, from its parts, but also like a relation of movement and rest.
This is a real medical term right now.
What was that? Somebody's phone talking? Oh, sorry. All right. Yeah, somebody told me that Spinoza is very popular here at the university. Yeah, and of course he's wonderful to read, and I always think Spinoza is very underrated as an analyst of the passions. He shows a lot of insight there, and of course Deleuze, the wave of Deleuze has helped spread Spinoza back into popularity again. There are obviously some differences with Triple O. One of them, the idea of a single substance will be treated by Triple O as an undermining, similar to the pre-Socratic Appian one. And I know Spinozists like to claim that there is room for real individuals in Spinoza. I'm just not quite convinced by that. And so since we have multiple individual objects in object-oriented ontology, we also have something like freedom rather than the determinism found in Spinoza. And Quentin Meillassoux has made a funny point, which is that philosophies of necessity always go with stoical ethics, of course, right? Because if everything is necessary, there's no reason to get too upset about everything, stay calm. And since his philosophy is a philosophy of absolute contingency, he wants to build an ethics of regrets, where you're lamenting everything. I shouldn't have done that. It changed everything by my making that decision instead of that. It affected the whole world badly, like a Woody Allen, ethics of Woody Allen, kind of a neurotic thing. But yeah, I guess the tendency of object-oriented ontology would be to read Spinoza in undermining terms. And we'd have to have a debate going through the text and seeing if he does actually account for individual objects enough, but I'm inclined to say no.